On an especially tense day, the housekeeper of a mansion belonging to a millionaire known for his coldness had to take her young son to work because no one in the family could help her that day. And in the blink of an eye, the child disappeared through the vast corridors. With her heart racing, she searched rooms and staircases, calling the boy's name at every door. With no answer, she took a deep breath and went to the millionaire's office to ask if he had seen him. When she turned the door handle and pushed the rain beat relentlessly against the mansion's tall windows, a constant, melancholy sound that blended with the solemn ticking of a grandfather clock in the entrance hall. Outside, the late afternoon in Westchester, New York, collapsed into shades of grey and wet asphalt. Inside, the white marble foyer gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier, reflecting the small body curled in Elisa's arms. Leo, 4 years old, with his damp curls and cheeks pink from the cold, dozed on her shoulder, oblivious to the scent of floor wax and expensive perfume that permeated the air. Elisa's heart beat erratically, a drum of anxiety against her ribs. The neighborhood daycare had been unexpectedly closed that morning. A rain-faded sign on the gate announcing a staff strike. With no one to leave her son with, the only alternative to missing a day's work was to break the most sacred rule of this place. In the service hallway, a polished metal plaque was explicit, "No children allowed." As if Elisa needed a reminder, Mrs. Albright, the head housekeeper who commanded the staff with the precision of a drill sergeant, emerged from the gloom of a side corridor. Her small, hard eyes scanned Elisa from the tips of her soaked shoes to the sleeping boy in her arms. She didn't need to raise her voice. She simply pointed to the plaque and read it in a sharp whisper, each word a small blow. "The rule is clear, Elisa." Humiliation burned Elisa's face, hotter than any fever. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat preventing any explanation. "I have no one to watch him, ma'am. It's just for today. My neighbor might be able to pick him up later." Mrs. Albright sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "Just today," she decreed, with the promise of a future reckoning in her eyes, "and I'd better not see him or hear him." Elisa nodded, grateful and terrified in equal measure. She settled Leo in a discreet corner near her cleaning cart, improvising a nest with her own coat. The boy, drowsy, played silently with 2 empty wax tins, turning them into imaginary cars. As Elisa scrubbed the marble floor with rhythmic, silent motions, her mind raced through the accumulating bills: the rent, the daycare spot she had to secure for next month, the overdue gas bill. The job in this mansion, with its silent opulence, was the only anchor keeping her from sinking. The owner of the house, a man surrounded by legends of coldness and power, a multi-millionaire who had built his immense fortune on high-risk stocks and venture capital, was an almost mythical figure. They said his net worth was incalculable, but his heart was made of stone. The phone in her apron pocket vibrated. A short text from her neighbor. "Hey girl, I can get Leo. Be there in 30. A wave of immense relief washed over Elisa. She smiled for the first time that afternoon and turned to tell her son the good news. But the corner where he had been was empty. Her coat was folded on the floor. The 2 wax tins toppled over. The cleaning cart creaked slightly. The hall clock went tick-tock, a sound now loud and menacing in the sudden silence. The corridor was deserted. Leo was gone. Panic rose in Elisa's throat, cold and suffocating. The mansion was a labyrinth of closed rooms, identical hallways, and mirrored doors that multiplied her solitude. Other staff members passed her, pretending not to notice her growing desperation. She climbed the main staircase, her feet heavy, calling her son's name in a whisper that barely escaped her lips. Her legs grew weak. Each closed door was a new wave of dread. Reaching the top, she saw the door to the main study slightly ajar. With trembling hands, she pushed it open and froze. Inside, leaning back in an imposing dark leather armchair, slept Mr. Sterling, the millionaire with a heart of stone, and on his chest, nestled and breathing peacefully, was Leo. The man's face, usually a mask of severity, was relaxed, almost gentle. Elisa stood motionless, the air trapped in her lungs, clutching the rubber gloves on her sweaty hands, unable to take the next step. The sound of Leo's soft breathing was the only real thing in the surreal study. Elisa felt the sweat turn cold in her gloved hands. Every second she remained there, paralyzed on the threshold, heightened the feeling that she was committing an unforgivable transgression. The scene before her was a paradox. The imposing figure of Arthur Sterling, the billionaire whose fortune was the stuff of legend in business journals, the man who had turned a small initial capital into an empire of assets and investments, seemed disarmed, almost human, with her son asleep on his chest. The soft light from the desk lamp cast a golden halo around them, a portrait of peace amid the silent luxury. A whisper escaped Elisa's lips, trembling and fragile. Leo. It was enough. Arthur stirred slowly, his eyes opening not with alarm, but with the confusion of someone waking from a deep sleep. He looked down at the boy in his lap, and an instinct seemed to take over. Before even noticing Elisa at the door, his lips formed the notes of an old melody, a soft lullaby about not saying a word. The shock hit Elisa with the force of a lightning bolt. It was the same song her grandmother used to sing to her, a melody born in the backyards of a working-class neighborhood, the soundtrack to a life that couldn't be further from this universe of wealth and power. How did this man, surrounded by gold and dollars, know that song? The image she had of him fractured once more, revealing something she couldn't decipher. It was then that he saw her. The melody died on his lips. He straightened in the armchair, the mask of coldness settling back onto his face, though it couldn't completely erase the softness of the previous moment. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply adjusted the small makeshift blanket over Leo and gestured for her to approach. "He wandered in here on his own," Arthur said, his voice low and controlled. "He was looking for you." Elisa approached, her heart still hammering. "I'm so sorry, sir. The daycare, I had no choice." He cut her off with a slight wave of his hand, as if her apologies were irrelevant. He pulled open a drawer, took out a sheet of letterhead paper and a black ink pen. He began to write. "I understand the circumstances, Elisa, but the mansion has rules, and rules are the foundation of any successful business, the structure that supports the assets." He spoke with the calmness of someone discussing the cash flow of one of his companies, not the presence of a frightened child. He turned the paper toward her. It was a formal written warning, citing the clause in her contract that forbade the presence of family members. "Sign it. And please." The sentence was a command, not a request. "Next time it will be termination. The rules are non-negotiable." Elisa looked at the paper, the elegant, firm letters seeming to mock her desperation. Pride burned inside her, screaming at her to refuse, to take her son and leave this cold place. But the image of the gas bill and the overdue rent loomed over everything. She needed this money. Swallowing her pride and her tears, she took the pen with a trembling hand and signed her name. He took the paper back, filed it in the drawer, and then, with surprising gentleness, lifted Leo and handed him to her. For an instant, their fingers touched. His were warm. As she left the study, her son safe in her arms, Elisa felt the weight of that signed paper in her pocket. Walking down the hall, she came face to face with Mrs. Albright. The housekeeper said nothing. She just gave a thin, victorious smile that promised Elisa's war was only just beginning. The days that followed were a silent torture. Elisa moved through the mansion like a ghost, feeling the weight of Mrs. Albright's gaze on the back of her neck with every step. The air, once merely rarefied by wealth, now seemed charged with a hostile electricity. Every staff member she passed either averted their eyes or offered a hurried greeting, tainted by the gossip the housekeeper had surely spread. The written warning, signed in Arthur's office, was an invisible mark on her forehead, a constant reminder of her fragility in this ecosystem of power and money. In the staff kitchen, during her brief coffee break, the atmosphere was even worse. Conversations would stop when she entered. One day, while heating up her lunch, she overheard a technician in a grey uniform talking to the gardener. "The camera system on the first floor will be offline for maintenance until tomorrow. Routine software update. The boss wants everything working perfectly." The man jotted something down on a clipboard, a maintenance log, and left without another thought. Elisa, however, felt a chill run down her spine, a bad feeling she couldn't explain. The opportunity was too perfect for Mrs. Albright to waste. The next morning, a quiet commotion stirred the service corridors. Mr. Sterling's leather wallet, which he usually left on his office desk, had vanished. The rumor spread like wildfire, whispered from one person to another. No one accused her directly, but the looks were like fingers pointing in her direction. She was the new one, the only one who had broken the rules, the desperate single mother who surely needed the money. The injustice burned in her face, an unbearable heat that made her want to scream. She cleaned the furniture with a contained fury, her knuckles white from gripping the damp cloth, and while the venomous whispers surrounded her. Hours later, the miracle happened. Mrs. Albright announced, with a poorly feigned expression of surprise, that she had found the wallet. It was behind a large fern in the main hallway. "How strange," she said loudly for anyone to hear. "It seems someone got scared and decided to put it back." The insinuation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elisa felt the floor disappear from under her feet. This time, it was Arthur himself who summoned her to the study. He was standing by the window, watching the drizzle that had started to fall again on the impeccable garden. His posture was rigid. "Mrs. Albright informed me of the incident," he began, without turning around. "She believes it was an interrupted theft attempt." Elisa opened her mouth to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? That she was innocent? Who would believe her? He finally turned, his cold eyes analyzing her. "I'm about to announce a philanthropic partnership of great importance to my business. The last thing I need is a domestic scandal. Image is one of the most valuable assets I own." He walked to his desk and pushed another sheet of paper toward her. "Publicly, the matter is closed. Not another word about it. But so there is no doubt about the consequences of any future slip-up. You will sign this second code of conduct." It was a small victory at a very high cost. He was protecting her, but at the same time chaining her even more tightly. The feeling of being on a tightrope was dizzying. She signed, her hand steadier this time, moved by a cold anger. At the end of the week, Arthur gathered the entire staff in the dining room. He announced that in 2 Saturdays there would be a large charity gala at the mansion and that he would offer extra, well-paid shifts for anyone who wanted to work the event. A murmur of approval went through the group. For Elisa, it was a chance to pay her bills. But as she looked up, she saw Mrs. Albright across the room. The housekeeper was staring at her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a glint that said she had just found the missing piece to set the perfect trap. The offer of extra shifts for the charity gala was both a blessing and a curse for Elisa. The extra money was more than welcome. It represented a chance to breathe, to pay off the gas bill, and secure the daycare payment without the specter of eviction haunting her nights. However, the prospect of spending even more time under the roof of that mansion, under the constant surveillance of Mrs. Albright, was agonizing. The housekeeper seemed energized by the wallet incident. She assigned tasks with a cruel precision, always giving Elisa the hardest jobs in the most isolated parts of the house, limiting her contact with other staff. It was a strategy of isolation, and it was working. Elisa felt the hallways narrowing around her, the marble walls seeming colder and more impersonal than ever. Loneliness was her constant companion, broken only by brief phone calls with her neighbor, Maria, who had become her confidant and main support system. At the start of the second week, unexpected news arrived, delivered by Arthur's driver during breakfast. The major philanthropic project the boss was about to announce, the partnership that required a flawless public image, would be centered on her neighborhood daycare. The plan was ambitious: a complete kitchen renovation, the purchase of new cribs, and the creation of a fund to ensure the facility's maintenance. Elisa's world seemed to shrink. That place, with its peeling walls and cracked cement floors that she knew so well, Leo's safe haven, would be invaded by the imposing, calculating presence of her boss. The coincidence was painful and, at the same time, inevitable. Who better to guide the project team in that unfamiliar territory than someone who knew it from the inside? The first site visit was scheduled for a sunny afternoon. Arthur, against all expectations, asked Elisa to accompany him. The ride in the luxury car, with its leather seats and the silence that insulated them from the city's traffic chaos, was tense. He asked objective questions about the daycare structure, about the most urgent needs, with the same detachment he would use to analyze an investment report. But as they passed through the institution's rusty iron gate, something changed. The familiar smell of fried dough from the corner stand permeated the car's air conditioning. A group of ladies from the local parish, aware of the visit, had set up a small table with coffee and cornbread. The traditions and sounds of the neighborhood enveloped Elisa like a warm hug, making her feel at home for the first time in days. Arthur, on the other hand, looked like a fish out of water. Awkward in his expensive suit, he accepted a piece of cornbread, visibly uncomfortable with the simplicity and human warmth surrounding him, trying to break the ice. He struck up a conversation with one of the parent volunteers about the local high school football team. To everyone's surprise, Arthur not only knew the team, but began to hum one of their fight songs, a popular tune that only someone who frequented the neighborhood bleachers would know by heart. The detail, small and fleeting, was another crack in his armor of coldness, another piece that didn't fit the image of the billionaire who built his empire from scratch, but seemed to have roots planted in much simpler soil than he let on. Elisa watched him from a distance, feeling a growing confusion. The housekeeper, who was also there to coordinate the event's logistics, observed the scene with barely concealed contempt. The forced proximity between the cleaner and the boss, the visibility it gave Elisa, was a direct affront to her power. And in Mrs. Albright's eyes, Elisa saw the promise that this small ascent would come at a very, very high price. The visit to the daycare extended into the afternoon, a mix of technical assessment and community interaction. While Arthur and his team of architects measured walls and discussed renovation budgets, the community rallied around them. Children ran through the yard, volunteers offered help, and the atmosphere was one of noisy, contagious hope. Leo, whom Maria had brought to meet his mother, was radiant. He ran among his friends, proud to show his mom the broken swing set that would soon be fixed. For the first time, Elisa felt that her two worlds, the silent toil at the mansion and the vibrant life of her neighborhood, were colliding in a way that could be positive. She became the natural bridge between Arthur's team and the residents, translating technical terms into language everyone understood and explaining the real needs of those families to the suited planners. This new, albeit unofficial, role gave her a dignity that her cleaner's uniform often stole. In the midst of this festive atmosphere, the small scare happened. One of the parish volunteers, a kind-faced old man, offered Leo a homemade peanut butter cookie. The boy, with the innocence of his 4 years, accepted and ate it with gusto. Minutes later, his skin began to flush and small hives appeared on his arms. A dry, persistent cough completed the picture. Elisa felt the blood drain from her face. Leo had a mild peanut allergy, something she managed carefully, but it had never manifested like this. Panic paralyzed her. It was Arthur who acted. Pale, but with a frightening calm, he ran to the car and returned in seconds. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out a small first aid kit. With steady hands, he administered a children's antihistamine that was already there, as if he had been prepared for this. He'll be fine. It's a mild reaction. We need to watch his breathing, he said, his voice controlled but with a note of urgency that betrayed a terrifying familiarity with the situation. Elisa, still trembling, watched the scene unfold. How did he know what to do with such precision? Why would a multimillionaire, who barely looked at his own staff, have a first aid kit with children's allergy medicine in his car? The answer came in a lapse of vulnerability. As he watched Leo calm down in his lap, Arthur murmured, more to himself than to her, "The same thing happened to my nephew once. It was much worse." The confession was brief, almost inaudible, but it opened a window into his soul. There was the source of his coldness, an old pain, a loss or a scare that had shaped him. That shared vulnerability, the visceral fear of losing someone they loved, created an invisible thread between them, a fragile but real connection. However, this growing closeness did not go unnoticed. From the other side of the yard, a tall, elegant woman with a smile that seemed rehearsed for photographers observed the scene. It was Veronica, Arthur's ex-fiancée. Her arrival was announced by the discreet purr of an imported car's engine. She approached on the pretense of wanting to see the project, but her eyes were fixed on the interaction between Arthur and Elisa. Veronica was a well-known figure in high society, a businesswoman whose own fortune depended on contracts and image. She moved closer to Arthur and, in a low, silky tone, said, "Darling, to close the deal with the European investors, your image needs to be impeccable. No domestic scandals, no inconvenient presences." Her gaze flickered for a second toward Elisa. The threat was clear. Dressed in silk and French perfume, she promised a generous donation to the daycare, a significant investment that would guarantee the project's success. In return, she coldly and calculatingly demanded that certain people be discreetly removed. The target was obvious. Arthur hesitated, the conflict visible on his face. In the mansion's hallway days later, Mrs. Albright was beaming with her new ally, and Elisa, her pride wounded and feeling the trap closing in, decided she would not depend on anyone's pity to defend herself. Veronica's presence in the equation changed the dynamic of the mansion from subtly hostile to openly threatening. Mrs. Albright, now backed by a powerful ally, no longer bothered to disguise her contempt. She walked the halls with an air of anticipated victory, handing out orders that felt like endurance tests, always with a condescending smile. Elisa felt the circle tightening, the tightrope she was walking now swaying dangerously over an abyss. The fear of losing her job was a physical pain, a constant ache in her stomach that made her lose her appetite. It was during a late-night call, her voice choked with emotion, that she confided in Maria. Her neighbor, pragmatic and wise from her own battles, was direct. "Honey, pride doesn't pay the bills, but dignity is priceless. If they want to play dirty, you have to learn how to defend yourself, not to attack, but to keep from being destroyed." Maria's advice ignited a spark of determination in Elisa. She would not be a passive victim. The next morning, driven by a courage she didn't know she possessed, she acted. She remembered the security technician and his note in the maintenance log. She waited for a moment when the small administration office was empty, her heart pounding against her chest. With trembling hands, she flipped through the clipboard until she found the date the wallet had disappeared. And there it was, in hurried script. First floor cameras offline for software update. Period 08OH to 17OH. The proof. the proof that the veiled accusation was a sham, a trap set in a deliberate blind spot. She pulled her simple phone from her pocket and, with sweaty fingers, photographed the page. The image was her first weapon, her first small trench in this silent war. The next day, Maria showed up at her door with a dusty box. Inside was an old baby monitor. "Haven't used it since my granddaughter grew up," she said. "The battery doesn't last long, but it works. Keep the receiver in your apron pocket. Say it's to listen for Leo if he's napping in one of the spare rooms. But we both know that walls have ears, and sometimes you need an extra ear of your own." Elisa accepted the device, feeling the weight of the small piece of plastic. It was an act of espionage, something that went against her nature. But the instinct for survival was louder. While Elisa built her silent defense, Arthur fought his own battles. Veronica was relentless. Dinners with investors, meetings about the profitability of new funds, conversations about how a billionaire's image directly affects his stock price. "Your personal life is an asset, Arthur," she would say, her voice as cold as clinking coins. "Any rumor of instability, any problem with your staff, can cost millions in capital. This woman is a liability, a risk your portfolio doesn't need to take." Arthur listened in silence, his face an impenetrable mask. But his eyes would sometimes drift to the figure of Elisa, cleaning the hall in the distance, a dissonant and stubbornly real piece in his world of numbers and projections. On the last day of the second week, the summons came. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you in the study." Elisa felt the floor vanish. This was it. With her heart in her throat, she walked down the all-too-familiar hallway. He didn't ask her to sit. He was standing, looking at a tablet screen, his expression grim. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice grave. He turned the device toward her. The image was from an external security camera, capturing a vendor making a delivery. The quality was poor, grainy, but the timestamp in the corner was clear, the exact day and time the wallet went missing. The camera caught a glimpse of the hallway where Elisa's cleaning cart was parked. And then, for a brief instant, a figure entered the frame, tampered with something near the cart and left. The image was blurry, a ghost on the recording, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It wasn't Elisa. It was Mrs. Albright. The image on the tablet hung between them, grainy and silent, yet screaming an undeniable truth. Elisa held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The fleeting, furtive silhouette of Mrs. Albright was the proof she thought she would never have. A sliver of light in a tunnel of silent accusations. For a moment, overwhelming relief washed over her. Justice, it seemed, wasn't completely blind. She looked up at Arthur, expecting to see confirmation of the housekeeper's dismissal, the end of this nightmare, but his expression wasn't one of resolution, it was one of even deeper conflict. He turned off the tablet and placed it on the desk, the gesture slow and heavy. "This doesn't prove everything," he said, his voice low, almost disappointed. "It doesn't show what she was doing, only that she was there. In a courtroom or a wrongful termination suit, her word, a long-time employee, against yours. It would be complicated and messy." His logic was cold, calculating, the same he surely used to analyze the risk of a cryptocurrency investment or the fluctuations of the stock market. His public image, his most precious asset, could not be tarnished. A scandal involving the firing of a loyal housekeeper based on an inconclusive video was a risk he wasn't willing to take. Not now. Her termination is off the table. For now, he continued, as if offering a crumb of consolation. Elisa tasted the bitter disappointment. The small victory of the video turned to dust. And then came the final blow, the condition for this precarious ceasefire. But one thing needs to be clear, Elisa. What happened that first night cannot, under any circumstances, happen again. Children are not allowed in this house. The rule is absolute and, as of today, unbreakable. It wasn't a warning, it was a decree. The study, which for a brief moment had seemed like a place of possible redemption, became a gilded cage once more. He was protecting her from immediate dismissal, but at the same time, he was imposing a new and painful obstacle in her already complicated life. The support system she had built with Maria, the flexibility of being able to count on her neighbor in an emergency, now had an impassable geographic boundary: the mansion gate. From that day on, Elisa's routine became a marathon of sacrifices. She had to wake up even earlier in the cold, dark morning to get Leo ready and walk him the long blocks to Maria's house, who, luckily, worked a schedule that allowed her to watch the boy. The cold, persistent New York rain had set in, turning the streets into dark, slick mirrors. As she walked against the wind, with Leo nestled in her arms under an umbrella too small for them both, Elisa would look up at the distant lights of the mansion on the hill. Inside, the air was heated, the polished hardwood floors gleamed, and the silence was broken only by the ticking of a clock that measured a different kind of time than hers. The distance between her real life, with the smell of wet asphalt and the effort of every step, and that world of protected wealth, felt greater than ever. The image of Arthur, the man who hummed working-class lullabies and acted with precision in a medical emergency, merged with that of the cold billionaire who weighed lives and jobs on a scale of risks and profits. Who was he, really? The question haunted her as the raindrops mixed with the silent tears streaming down her face, a testament to the new phase of her battle, lonelier, colder, and harder than anything she had ever faced. The third week arrived with the intensity of a gathering storm. The mansion, once a sanctuary of silence and order, now buzzed with a tense, controlled energy. The approaching charity gala had turned the hallways into thoroughfares for decorators, florists, and lighting technicians. Every detail was meticulously planned to reflect the power and sophistication of Arthur Sterling, a man whose financial empire spanned continents, with investments in high-risk funds and a personal fortune that placed him on the list of the country's most influential billionaires. Amid this frantic activity, Mrs. Albright thrived. Clipboard in hand, she was the queen of this organized chaos, and her eyes seemed to find Elisa with alarming frequency, always with a sharp smile on her face. On Tuesday, the centerpiece for the grand ballroom arrived, delivered by men in white gloves from a climate-controlled truck. It was a rare Persian rug, a family heirloom, whose value was whispered in astronomical figures. Its texture was like silk beneath the fingers, and its colors, a mosaic of deep wines and blues, seemed to hold centuries of history. Mrs. Albright's order was clear, spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. This rug is irreplaceable, part of the family's legacy. It cannot, under any circumstances, sustain any kind of stain. The final cleaning of the ballroom, before we place the furniture, is yours, Elisa. The challenge had been thrown, a monumental responsibility placed on the most fragile shoulders of the staff. The next afternoon, with the clock ticking against her, Elisa entered the empty ballroom. The rug dominated the space, magnificent and intimidating. On her cleaning cart, Mrs. Albright had solicitously left a new bottle of special liquid wax for the hardwood floors surrounding the piece. "Use this one, dear. It's imported. The best for getting the shine Mr. Sterling demands," she had said, with a venomous sweetness. The pressure was immense. Elisa began to work, her movements quick and efficient. As she approached one edge of the rug, her foot nearly slipped on the freshly waxed floor. She caught her balance, her heart racing. That's when she smelled it, the scent. It wasn't the gentle aroma of beeswax she knew so well. It was a chemical, oily, pungent odor. She stopped, her cloth suspended in the air. Her mind screamed. It was an alarm, a survival instinct honed by weeks of distrust. She looked at the bottle. The label was for the imported wax. Perfect. Was she imagining things? Tired? Paranoid? Time was running out. The decorators were waiting outside, but the feeling of danger was too real to ignore. With her heart in her throat, she dabbed some of the liquid onto a clean cloth and went to a hidden corner of the room, behind a heavy velvet curtain. She crouched down and rubbed a small, invisible section of the baseboard. The wood didn't shine. Instead, it grew dark, sticky, stained by a corrosive oil. It was a powerful stripper, disguised. If she had used it around the rug, the inevitable splashes would have destroyed the centuries-old fibers, causing irreparable damage. The trap was diabolical in its simplicity. A cold relief and a hot anger surged through her. She had saved the rug, but when she looked at the clock on the wall, she saw she had lost nearly half an hour. The time to deliver a spotless ballroom was gone, and as she turned, she came face to face with Mrs. Albright in the doorway, her face a mask of false concern and poorly concealed triumph. "Not finished yet, Elisa. Mr. Sterling detests delays." The false concern on Mrs. Albright's face was a masterpiece of dissimulation. Elisa felt a chill, helplessness replacing her anger. She had no way to prove the sabotage. Her word against the housekeepers was worthless. "There was a problem with the product, ma'am. I had to check it," she replied, her voice steady despite her internal trembling. The housekeeper just smiled, a gesture that didn't reach her icy eyes. "Problems, Elisa, or excuses for being slow? Come now, the decorators can't wait. Mr. Sterling hates when the schedule for his events is delayed. The profitability of his image depends on perfection." The reprimand was public, in front of the decorating team that was beginning to enter the ballroom, and each word was another nail in her professional coffin. Elisa finished her work in silence, under the curious and pitying gazes of the others, her face burning with humiliation. On the eve of the gala, the mansion was a stage about to host its grand performance. Veronica arrived in the mid-afternoon, gliding out of a black sedan, like a panther in a silk dress. She wasn't there as a guest, but as a director. She inspected every flower arrangement, every lighting adjustment, her presence an assertion of power and control. She and Arthur were scheduled to meet with journalists before the event began. Her image needed to be brilliant and untouchable, as she told him loudly in the entrance hall. Behind the scenes, however, her focus was elsewhere. She found Mrs. Albright in the hallway leading to the silver vault. "We need to solve that little problem once and for all," Veronica said, her voice a whisper of steel. "Arthur may be a business genius, but he has a blind spot for these people. Sentimentality doesn't generate profit." Mrs. Albright nodded, her eyes gleaming with complicity. "What do you suggest?" Veronica smiled, a cold, calculated gesture. She opened her designer handbag and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is for you, for your loyalty. In return, I want you to create an incident during the gala, something that looks like pure incompetence on her part, a major failure, in front of the guests and, especially, the journalists. A stain on the silverware, the wrong cleaning product. Be creative. I want grounds for a performance-based dismissal, indisputable." The plan was cruel and final. Mrs. Albright took the envelope, the paper crinkling like a promise of victory. They headed to the vault, a cold, seldom-used room at the end of the service hall, to finalize the details. At that exact moment, Elisa was exhausted. The day had been long and the tension unbearable. As she passed through the hallway, she saw the two women moving away and felt a knot in her stomach. The fatigue was overwhelming. She paused for a moment, leaning her cart against the wall to massage her temples. In an automatic gesture to lighten her load, she took off her apron and folded it over the cart. The small receiver of the baby monitor, forgotten in her pocket, slipped out and landed silently on a pile of clean towels destined for the vault. Minutes later, arriving in the staff kitchen for her break, Elisa reached into her pocket by habit and felt the emptiness. Panic hit her. Maria's device. She had lost it. She retraced her steps, Her heart racing, she saw the apron on the cart, but the receiver was gone. One of the young men on the cleaning crew, helpful, pointed down the hall. "I saw Mrs. Albright take those towels to the vault. I think your gadget was with them." Elisa ran. As she approached the heavy wooden door, she heard whispered voices from inside. Veronica's voice, unmistakable. "The stain needs to look accidental, but catastrophic." And Mrs. Albright's, in response, "Don't worry, she'll hand the stained tray to the boss herself," without even realizing. Elisa froze, her hand inches from the doorknob, the blood turning to ice in her veins. The night of the gala arrived, cloaking the mansion in an aura of fantasy and power. In the garden, yellow lights hung from the trees like swarms of fireflies, illuminating the path for guests arriving in silent, expensive cars. Inside, the air vibrated with the sound of a string quartet and the murmur of polite conversation. The scent of rosemary and butter wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the imported perfume that floated through the ballroom. It was a spectacular display of wealth, an event where every crystal glass and every canapé represented a fraction of Arthur Sterling's vast fortune. Journalists circulated discreetly, their expensive shoes silent on the polished marble, observing the tycoons whose decisions moved the stock market. Elisa, in her immaculate uniform, moved along the edges of the party, her senses on high alert. Every smile exchanged between Mrs. Albright and Veronica was like a danger signal. She knew the trap was set. She just didn't know how or when it would be sprung. Suddenly, nature intervened with a fury typical of the region. The wind lashed the windows, and a thunderstorm that had been brewing for hours broke over the city. Thunder rumbled, followed by a flash of lightning that for a second turned night into day, and then darkness. Part of the mansion's power went out, plunging the main hall into a dimness lit only by emergency lights and the screens of guests' cell phones. The chaos was immediate, though restrained. Amid this confusion, Maria arrived at the service gate. With the torrential rain, the rideshare driver, late and confused, had dropped her at the wrong entrance. She was bringing a jacket Leo had forgotten. The boy, frightened by the thunder and the sudden darkness, slipped from her hand and, drawn by the voices, ran inside, instantly losing himself in the forest of legs and long gowns. Maria's muffled cry reached Elisa's ears. Panic, that old acquaintance, threatened to rise in her throat. But this time, something was different. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to be calm. She remembered the first night, the silence, the fear, and then, above the murmur of the guests, she heard it, faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable, the melody of "Hush, little baby." Without hesitating, she left the tray she was holding on a table and followed the sound, climbing the grand staircase, her heart beating in a rhythm of hope and fear. The study door was ajar, just like the other time. Inside, the scene repeated itself, but with a crucial difference. Arthur was awake, sitting in the armchair, with Leo held securely in his lap. The window behind him rattled with the wind, and he was staring out at the storm as he sang. He saw her at the door and wasn't surprised. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, a vulnerability that completely disarmed his billionaire persona. "He came straight here," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think the sound calmed him." Elisa approached, not knowing what to say. He was the one who broke the silence, the confession pouring out like a dam that had finally burst. "I learned that lullaby from the woman who took care of me when I was a boy. After they took away my right to see my own son, after a terrible unjust divorce, I lost everything that mattered. The coldness," he looked down at his own hands, "was the armor I built so I wouldn't break apart inside again." The revelation hit her with the force of a wave. The man behind the suit, the capital, the fortune, was a wounded father. The great emotional turning point happened right there in that moment of raw truth. But the moment of connection was brutally interrupted. The lamplight was suddenly overwhelmed by the bright glare of the chandelier in the ceiling. The power was back, and with it, the sound of hurried, angry footsteps approaching down the hall. The light that flooded the study seemed to break the spell of that confessional moment. Reality, in its cruelest form, invaded the sanctuary of vulnerability they had created. The door flew open, and Mrs. Albright stormed in, her face contorted in a mask of theatrical indignation. Behind her, Veronica appeared, a press aide in tow, his phone already positioned to record whatever happened next. The target, Elisa realized with a chill, had always been her, but the stage was now much larger. "Mr. Sterling, a disaster!" the housekeeper exclaimed, her voice laden with false panic. "The silverware for the main course, it's all tarnished. The cleaner used the wrong product. An abrasive that should never have been near the family heirlooms." Veronica strode forward, her gaze withering. "This is unacceptable, Arthur. In the middle of the most important event of the year, with the press here. This is the kind of gross failure that shows a complete lack of control over your own house, your own staff. How can investors trust your business if you can't even ensure the integrity of your own assets?" she said, each word calculated to wound his public image. The aide discreetly aimed his phone, the small red recording light blinking. The moment was perfect. The out-of-place child, the incompetent employee, the domestic chaos exposed. Elisa's dismissal would be justified, and Veronica's influence reaffirmed. Elisa felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs were shaking, and for a second, she thought she might faint. The trap was brilliant. Any denial would sound like desperation, but then the image of Leo, safe in Arthur's arms, the man's choked voice confessing his pain, Maria's advice echoing in her mind. It all merged into a current of unexpected strength. Trembling, but with a cold determination, she took a step forward. "That's not true." The words came out firmer than she expected. She opened the small purse she carried, an old gift from her mother. Her phone was inside. With nimble fingers, she found the photo gallery. "On the day your wallet disappeared, sir," she began, her voice gaining strength with each syllable, "the first-floor cameras were offline for maintenance." She turned the phone screen, showing the clear photo of the maintenance log page to Arthur. "The technician can confirm it." A murmur of surprise came from the aide. Veronica tried to interrupt, but Elisa continued, the adrenaline now uncontrollable. "And this is a video from a vendor's security camera, which shows Mrs. Albright tampering with my cleaning cart at that exact time." She played the grainy video, the unmistakable silhouette moving furtively. Mrs. Albright turned pale, her mouth opening in a protest that never came. "And as for the silverware," Elisa took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I didn't touch it, but I heard the plan." She opened her recording app. The small baby monitor, which she had retrieved from the vault and kept in her pocket ever since, had captured everything. She pressed play. Veronica's hissing voice filled the tense silence of the study. "The stain needs to look accidental, but catastrophic." And Mrs. Albright's reply, clear and undeniable, "Don't worry, she'll hand the stained tray to the boss herself, without even realizing." The silence that followed was deafening. The security chief, summoned hastily, confirmed the authenticity of the log entry. The HR manager, pale, reminded everyone of the company's most basic rule: documented evidence speaks louder than rumors. The game had turned. The baby monitor audio ended, and the low static that followed was the only thing that broke the petrified silence in the study. Everyone in the room looked like a statue in a museum of raw emotion. Mrs. Albright's face crumbled, her mask of arrogance shattering to reveal a pale, undisguised panic. Veronica, on the other hand, looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her predatory smile faltered, surprise giving way to an icy fury that hardened her perfectly made-up features. She was the first to recover, trying to reverse the disaster with the only tool she knew: Intimidation. This is absurd, a ridiculous fabrication, she hissed, taking a step toward Elisa. A desperate cleaner trying to extort money, planting false evidence. Arthur, think of your assets, your business. Are you going to believe her? This is a risk to your capital, a scandal that could tank your stock price. Get rid of her. But Arthur's gaze wasn't on Veronica. It was fixed on Elisa, on the trembling dignity with which she held her phone, on the quiet courage that held her upright. He then looked down at the sleeping boy in his lap, a warm, real weight that anchored him to the truth. The armor of coldness, already cracked, finally crumbled to dust. He rose slowly, the power of his presence now emanating not from his fortune, but from a newfound moral authority. He first addressed the HR manager. The evidence is clear and irrefutable. Proceed according to the rules. Then, his steel-like eyes locked onto Mrs. Albright. Mathilde, you're fired. For cause, I want you to collect your things and be off this property in 1 hour. The housekeeper let out a choked sound, her legs giving way, and had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Next, he turned to Veronica. The disappointment in his face was sharper than any anger. Our professional arrangement is terminated, Veronica, and so is anything else that existed between us. She opened her mouth to protest, but he silenced her with a gesture. You talk about assets and net worth and cash flow, but you forgot that integrity is the only asset that truly matters, and it's priceless. The kind of image you build on a foundation of lies and cruelty no longer interests me. Some liabilities are simply unacceptable. He glanced at her aide. I'm asking you to leave. Now, the humiliation was complete. Veronica, livid with rage, turned on her heel and stormed out, the door slamming shut like a gunshot in the silence. Arthur didn't stop there. With Leo still in his arms, he walked out of the study, followed by a stunned Elisa. He stopped at the top of the grand staircase, facing the ballroom where the guests, still confused by the power outage, were beginning to regroup. He lightly tapped a glass with his fingernail, the crystal-clear sound commanding everyone's attention. The chatter died down. The journalists' cameras turned to him. Ladies and gentlemen, my apologies for the interruption, he began, his voice resonating with a clarity no one there had ever heard. There's been a change of plans. Tonight, I've discovered that the real investments, the ones with the highest returns, aren't on the stock market, but in the community. Therefore, a significant portion of the funds raised at this gala, along with a personal donation, will be immediately directed to fully fund the neighboring community's daycare center. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. In a single gesture, he had redefined his legacy, reconciling with his own conscience. After the announcement, amid the commotion, he turned. The world of the party seemed to fade away. His eyes met Elisa's, who was watching everything from the doorway. He took a step toward her, his gaze filled with an apology and something more, something she didn't dare name. The ballroom, once a stage for power and wealth, had transformed into a theater of human emotion. Arthur's announcement hung in the air, shocking the guests and sending the journalists into a silent frenzy, eager to decipher the twist, but Arthur seemed to notice none of it. He crossed the space separating him from the study door, moving with a gravity that made the crowd part before him as if he were a force of nature. His eyes, which had once carried the weight of an empire of business and assets, were now focused on one person, Elisa. He stopped a few feet from her, the vulnerability in his face more eloquent than any speech. With Leo still asleep in his arms, he spoke, his voice low, meant only for her, yet carrying the weight of a public confession. Elisa, I am so sorry. The words were simple, but they contained the universe of regret he finally allowed himself to feel. I'm sorry for leaving you so exposed, for putting the cold rules of my house, the blind protection of my assets, above your dignity and your safety. I was so busy building walls around my fortune that I didn't realize I was trapping myself inside them. My coldness wasn't strength, it was fear. And because of my fear, I almost allowed a great injustice to be committed under my own roof. The tears Elisa had held back for 3 weeks, tears of fear, humiliation, and anger, finally found a way out. They streamed down her face silently, not from pain, but from a relief so profound it felt like it was washing her soul, cleaning all the wounds. She no longer saw the billionaire, the untouchable boss. She saw the man who sang lullabies and who, just like her, knew the fear of losing what he loved most. "I can't erase what you went through," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can try to make it right, and not as a favor, but as your right." He took a deep breath, as if the next decision was the most important investment of his life. "I want to offer you a direct employment contract with my main company, no longer as a contractor, with a fair salary that recognizes not just your work, but your integrity, and the daycare, the one the foundation will rebuild. The first spot, the first guaranteed enrollment, is Leo's, for as long as he needs it." The promise was the end of all her sleepless nights, the end of the race against time, the end of fear. It was stability, security, peace. It was everything. He took another step closer to return Leo to her arms. The boy, sensing the movement, snuggled into his mother's embrace without waking. In that delicate exchange, Arthur's hand covered hers for an instant. His hands were warm and steady. Hers were trembling. It wasn't the touch of a boss and an employee, nor a romantic gesture. It was a silent meeting of two souls who had seen each other's fragility, a promise of respect and of something new that, perhaps, could grow slowly with time. Around them, the guests watched in reverent silence. They had come expecting to celebrate wealth and profit, but they had witnessed something far rarer, the redemption of a man and the victory of a woman's dignity. Justice, on that night, was not found in the codes of the stock market, but in the touch of two hands that met on the threshold of a new beginning. The crowd in the ballroom was a sea of bewildered faces, an ocean of whispers and curious glances. But for Elisa, it had all faded into background noise, distant and unimportant. The only focal point in her universe was the warmth of Arthur's hand on hers and the comforting weight of Leo asleep in her arms. Arthur, with a calmness that seemed to spring from a newly discovered source, gently guided her away from the center of attention, back into the quiet of the study. The door closed, muffling the sounds of the party and the world. Outside, the storm was subsiding, and the heavy rain had softened to a gentle drizzle that drummed softly against the glass. The grandfather clock in the hall could be heard again, but its ticking no longer sounded like a countdown to disaster. It was a companionable sound, marking the start of a new time. In the silence of the study, Elisa finally allowed herself to breathe. The weight of months of fear, the anxiety that had become a constant companion on her shoulders, simply dissolved into the air like steam from a kettle. She looked at the man before her, the billionaire whose fortune had seemed as intimidating as the walls of the mansion, and saw only Arthur, a father, a wounded man, a human being who had found his way back to himself. "Thank you," she whispered, the word heavy with everything that didn't need to be said. "But you didn't have to do all of that. The announcement, the donation." He shook his head, a weary but genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "Don't call it a donation, Elisa. Call it an investment, the best one I've ever made. My legacy won't just be a collection of financial assets. It will be this. It will be the kitchen in a daycare, the new cribs, the chance for a child to have a safe place to be while his mother works." He walked to the window and looked out at the garden, where the party lights shimmered on the wet grass. "For a long time, I measured my worth in dollars, in gold, in the return on my investments. But tonight, because of you, I realized that a person's true net worth is measured by their capacity for justice, and I was bankrupt. As he turned back, his eyes fell on Leo. The expression on his face was no longer that of a stranger, but of someone who recognized the preciousness of that small life. He reached out and, with infinite gentleness, brushed a curl from the boy's forehead. Elisa felt her heart warm. The mansion, with its scent of wax and expensive perfume, no longer felt like an oppressive labyrinth. The high walls were no longer a prison, but a silent witness to her resilience. When they left the study and descended the grand staircase, the